Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our look at armoured actions. And the themes this week are kind of doctrine, strategy, manoeuvrability, those types of things. And it's interesting, when I scheduled this, I hadn't quite realised the date it fell on, but 79 years ago today was the conclusion of the Battle of Stalingrad. At least that's when they recognise it over there. We're actually going back 6-7 weeks prior to that, to kind of mid-December, when things aren't quite so clear. And what I would like to call, although Prit, our guest, may disagree with me, the greater Battle of Stalingrad, because there's the kind of the city one, then there's the wider battlefield, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on, area sort of south of the battlefield. But you know him already because he's been on World War II TV a number of times, always goes down very well. So Prit Buttar, prolific author, new books coming out in the future. So we're going to bring him in now. So good evening, Prit. How are you doing today?
Good evening. It's lovely to be back, and yeah, a bit bleak outside, but hey, it's fine. It's winter.
And we've just had a conversation about curries, which was really good. Cliche, but we have been talking about that. But and also, always, folks, the links to Prit's books are in the description below. You know, you can't go wrong there. They're brilliant. But you know, this week, we know, as we said in the introduction there, we're going to be talking about the greater kind of examination of tactics, things like that. And before we leap into your presentation, of course, when we're talking about the Eastern Front, everything is larger and bigger and greater. The numbers are greater. In your research of this, is it perhaps harder to kind of identify tactics at a sort of a more like sort of divisional level because of the sheer size of things?
I think it is, and today we're going to talk about a couple of things which I think have been forgotten largely. The battle we're going to talk about was absolutely crucial to the failure of the German relief effort at Stalingrad, and also one of the decisions we'll talk about, I think, was one of the most critical decisions that was made. I would encourage anybody who looks at the Eastern Front just to find these battlefields on Google Maps and then to scroll across without changing the scale of the map to more familiar parts of Western Europe, just to see the scale of these battlefields. They are just immense. We're talking about actions fought across the size of small countries, really. And it's so easy to lose sight of that.
I did that very thing today. Putting up some Google Earth. I was thinking, what scale am I at here? Because I was scrolling and scrolling. I thought, there's going to be a city coming here, so scrolling and scrolling. And then finally a river came in. Hang on, we're only got the river. I was just amazed. I mean, you know it. As you said there, we know it's vast, but your brain just can't, in a sense, take on the enormity of it. But anyway, so we're off to that, say, December, mid-December. So set the scene for us. We'll bring up the slides there and I'll hand it over to you. And folks, if you've got questions and comments, far away as we're going, we can do kind of bigger questions at the end, so little ones as we go along. But basically, I'm going to hand over to the good doctor to explain this, because it's not a battlefield I'm particularly familiar with.
Well, thank you very much. So the Germans have been grinding their way through Stalingrad for most of the late summer and autumn, and they've pretty much taken about 80% of the city, 85% of the city. They can't quite clear out the last little pockets that are held by Churkov's defiant defenders. And all the time, Zhukov and Vasilevsky have been assembling these powerful forces along the flanks, preparing for a counterattack. Slight digression here. Zhukov built his reputation on a battle in Mongolia called Khalkhin Gol, where he defeated the Japanese, where he effectively did something very, very similar. He allowed the Japanese to advance and then attacked their flanks. And this becomes a running theme in his operations. So for him, this was just a golden opportunity to have an action replay of what he had done before. He actually tried to take a lot of credit for what followed. I would say Vasilevsky played a bigger part than him in the detailed planning, but I'm digressing here. You can see here, this was the path of the counterattack. These two massive forces striking far to the rear of the battlefield and deliberately targeting the Romanian forces on either flank, and then advancing rapidly to meet at Kalash, seize the Don crossings there, and isolate 6th Army. And all of this unfolded in the last week of November. And as it did so, the scale of the the catastrophe became clear to Germans at varying points. But it's a graphic example of the posture that you have when you're mounting an offensive with all of your troops at the tip of the spear is completely different from what you need to defend, when you need mobile forces behind your front line. And the Germans are just playing catch up all the time. So by the time we get to our storyline, we're on this dotted line much further west. The Germans are going to concentrate their relief column at Kotelnikovo down at the bottom of this map in order to try to reach Stalingrad. There is an area further north that is much closer to the encirclement, but Manstein turns his face against that because it would involve at least one crossing of the Don River, which is a major obstacle, and there are various terrain disadvantages to that. Whereas advancing from the south, there are these minor rivers in the path of the advance, but really they're not as great a problem as crossing the Don. And there's also a valuable railway line. The problem of approaching from the northern, the closer approach would be that by the time they got to Kalash, the bridges there would almost certainly have been destroyed. So it really would still have been a very difficult undertaking.
And just talking about the distance, even though we have these vast distances, it does all come down to crossing points. Like in any campaign, whether it's Burma or Normandy, rivers, bridges, choke points, junctions, it all comes down to that. There may be a larger distance between these type of points, but it all does come down to this, particularly when we're talking, as we are this week, armored divisions.
Yeah, and of course it's worth remembering that the whole premise of the German attack towards Stalingrad and into the Caucasus was to relieve Germany's long-term fuel shortages. So this isn't like the Western Allies where they could rely on trucks, etc., to keep their forces supplied. Germany was very much dependent upon railroads to keep its forces supplied, hence the even greater importance of bridges. You can't really improvise as the train. It needs a decent bridge in order to get across it. Now, when it comes to the details of what we're going to talk about, I'll just talk a little bit about sources, because this may be a little bit of an insight for people about the problems when you come to write books about this sort of thing. Essentially, there are three sources that are used in describing the battles that we describe. Probably the most popular are the memoirs of Erhard Raus, who was commander of 6th Panzer Division at the time. Unfortunately, these are almost certainly the least accurate of all of the source material. He gets the dates wrong very frequently, and as with all memoirs, they're written largely to reflect very well upon him and upon his men. The German unit war diaries are probably the most accurate in terms of chronology and precisely who was where, etc. But of course, they're giving only one side of the picture, and they don't give the view of what's happening on the Soviet side. The Soviet sources fill in that gap, and during the 90s at least, those were freely accessible. The problem is the dates in those don't necessarily correlate with the German dates, and there are discrepancies there. For the purposes of this narrative, I have stuck to the timeline as per the German war diaries, because my opinion was that given that those were produced on a day-by-day basis, they're probably going to be the most accurate in terms of chronology.
Thank you for that.
So we're going to start with this build-up around Kotelnikovo and the strike towards Stalingrad. This was part of 4th Panzer Army, 57th Panzer Corps under Kirchner, and he was going to have 3 panzer divisions for this. 6th Panzer, which had been re-equipping in Brittany, supported by 23rd Panzer Division on its right flank and 17th Panzer Division on its left flank. They were both already in theatre on the Eastern Front. Unlike 6th Panzer, they started in a weakened state, and some of their units would not make it to the start line in time really to take part in this campaign. But nonetheless, 3 panzer divisions, even at less than full strength, would have been a considerable force. But as we'll see, they weren't all available up front. 6th Panzer starts this under the command of Erhard Raus. The Panzer regiment is commanded by Walter von Hühnersdorf, who plays really the main command role in the battles that follow. The division is completely at full strength. It's been re-equipping in France, having some field exercises. It's in pretty cracking form. Most of its armored units are equipped with long-barreled Panzer IIIs with 50mm guns. These are pretty good at close range. They're not going to be able to deal with a T-34 at medium to long range, though. And each heavy company is equipped with long-barreled Panzer IVs with 75s, and these are the real business. They're the ones that can take on a T-34 with success. The journey from Brittany to this sector took 3 weeks. These tanks were on trains, trundling across Germany. The troops were enduring cramped conditions in these trains as they moved back to the Eastern Front where they had been previously. And they finally started arriving in Kotelnikovo on the 27th of November. So this is about a week after the trap has sprung around Stalingrad. They were already en route beforehand. It's worth remembering that this division was headed east in any event. As soon as it arrived at Kotelnikovo, it found itself in action. A Soviet cavalry corps had closed right up to the town, and as the troops piled off the train, they were under shell fire. They had to deploy very, very rapidly, fight off the outliers of the Soviet formation, and then the rest of the disembarkation actually went quite smoothly. However, whilst he was waiting for his division to arrive with all its rear area elements, and particularly waiting for 17th and 23rd Panzer divisions to arrive, Raus decided that he needed to do something about this cavalry corps that was lurking to the north of Kotelnikovo. So he mounted an operation around a small village called Pochlebin, which was an opportunity for his men, if you like, to get their equipment moving again, etc. And it proved to be a great success. The battle at Pochlebin came the day after the division started arriving in Kotelnikovo. This is the first point at which his narrative differs from the war diaries in terms of exact timings. But it was a very successful operation. They sent 2 battle groups up there. One blocked the advance of the cavalry corps. The other one moved up on its western flank and then attacked it in flank and rear and pretty much smashed it. One of the results of this was that this battle group that took part in this attack, only part of 6th Panzer Division, accumulated a remarkable set of trophies. They accumulated a small herd of cavalry ponies and camels. And many of the officers and soldiers, and particularly the senior NCOs within 6th Panzer, were former cavalrymen themselves. And the diary describes how they entertained themselves greatly with some of their captured trophies. And for my money, for all of the horror and the atrocities and brutality of the Eastern Front, this is one of the most joyous photographs I've ever come across of the Eastern Front. And you know, it doesn't really matter what you think of the sides of combatants. You kind of hope this guy survived to tell his grandkids about how he rode camels on the Russian steppe.
And them not believing him.
Well, indeed. And the account in the war diary says that the advance party continued entertaining itself with these camels and horses until receipt of a sharp order from division headquarters. I would love to have seen the text of that order, something along the lines of, "Will you lot stop dicking about with camels and get on with preparing for the operation?"
Well, on a serious note, they just interrupt you, Prit. You know, when we're talking, you talked about them having made this 3-week journey from Brittany. At this point, you have, shall we say, in this area, German units with very, very different levels of motivation, because some have seen things go well and then see things go badly. Others have only seen things go badly because they arrive after started things going badly. So how important is it for what we're going to be talking about, that this unit are in high spirits.
Well, they're in cracking form, and all of the accounts I've come across of the veterans, of the war diary of Rouse and others, just emphasise that exactly as you say, they're on top form. They're very confident. The traumas of the previous winter are forgotten. They've re-equipped. They have pretty much the best equipment that is available to a Panzer division at that time, and they're at full strength. So they're left thinking, provided the plan goes accordingly, we're going to do okay here. We should be able to, we've knocked the Russians over before, we should be able to do so again. The problem is, though, that 57th Panzer Corps assembles very slowly. 23rd Panzer Division eventually forms up on the right of 6th Panzer Division. 17th Panzer is coming down from Army Group Center, and Hitler diverts it to stand behind the Italian 8th Army further north, because he's worried the Italians might come under attack. He's absolutely correct, but not at the time that he diverts 17th Panzer. So when this relief operation to reach Stalingrad starts, only 1.5 of the 3 Panzer divisions have assembled. 6th Panzer is now present in complete strength. 23rd is arriving, and remember, it's starting at less than full strength, and 17th is still en route. It's belatedly been released and is now coming down from the Middle Don, leaving the Italians exposed. And as we'll find out, he was absolutely right. They were about to come under attack, but by then 17th Panzer was on its way. So meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the Soviets had made their first attempt to reduce the encirclement in an operation called Operation Ring, and the Germans had fought it off. And for the Red Army, this was the first inkling of just how many troops they had encircled at Stalingrad. This led to quite a change in thinking in the upper circles of the Red Army. The 2nd Guards Army had been earmarked for a follow-on operation. The encirclement of Stalingrad was known as Operation Uranus, and the Red Army was planning Operation Saturn, which was a thrust across the Middle Don through the ranks of the Italians, striking at Rostov, near the Sea of Azov, in order not only to further extend the encirclement of 6th Army, but also to cut off the German forces that were operating south of the Don all the way into the Caucasus. But the decision was made to divert 2nd Guards Army away from Operation Saturn to reinforce the troops encircling Stalingrad. This actually resulted in Saturn being downgraded into what became known as Little Saturn, which was a less ambitious operation. And instead of thrusting all the way on to Rostov, on this map, Rostov is about the same distance again further south, or probably even a little bit more than that, and slightly to the left too. But it was decided that actually, if we can just reach the northern Donetsk and knock out, particularly at the bottom right-hand side, you will see 2 particular names, Morozovsk and Tatsinskaya. These were the airfields from which the air bridge to Stalingrad is being maintained. If the Red Army could reach those, that would be a critical blow against the Germans. So they decided to reduce the scale of this. But 2nd Guards Army is now on its way to reinforce the encirclement. So on 12th of December, Winter Storm begins. This is the relief effort. 6th Panzer strikes out from Kotelnikovo and very rapidly reaches the river Aksay, which is the first obstacle in its path. And there's a river here at the bottom. They reached it in one day, and to the left of this map, there was still the remnants of the Soviet cavalry that had caused all the problems when 6th Panzer arrived. So on the first day, when they reached Salievsky, Rouse was concerned about that open flank. This is where 17th Panzer Division was meant to be, but it hadn't turned up. So although the Germans reached the river relatively early that day, just after midday, Rouse diverted the armoured battle group away to the left in order to round up this cavalry and drive it off. At the time, given what he knew, it was absolutely the right thing to do. He had to cover his open flank. The price of it was, though, that it left him, slightly behind schedule. He had actually surprised the Red Army with his attack. I don't think they'd really expected the relief effort to be made from here. And had they pressed on, they would probably have made better ground. But at the time, that was the decision that was taken. During the night after the Germans had reached the Axis, there were further discussions in Moscow. And Vasilevsky, who was overseeing the entire theatre, requested that Second Guards Army was switched away from reinforcing the encirclement to blocking this relief column. Rokossovsky was in charge of the encirclement in general, and he was reluctant to do so. He wanted Second Guards to make another big assault to crush Paulus and Sixth Army. But Stalin sided with Vasilevsky and diverted Second Guards down towards this sector. So as the battle now develops, there is a race against time. The Germans have a limited amount of time to push through to Stalingrad before the Soviets can reinforce their defenses. If Second Guards Army deploys in the path of 6th Panzer and the other Panzer divisions, they're not going to get to Stalingrad. So this is very much, now it's a matter of the Red Army's defenders, 4th Mechanized Corps here. They've really got to hold off the Germans for as long as they can until these promised reinforcements arrive. So at this point, the diversion of the battle group to deal with that cavalry corps starts to become significant. You've already lost half a day by sending them off there.
We've got a question here from Dave. Were bridges available to 6th Panzer, or did they have to build a crossing?
Well, we're going to come on to that because on the 13th, Hunersdorf took the armoured battle group of 6th Panzer across the bridge at Saleyevsky with the intention of striking towards Verkhne Kumsky. One battalion of tanks had crossed with a motorcycle company when he decided to drive across and join the battle group. And his tank broke the bridge. I mean, how embarrassing is that? You're the battle group commander and you've destroyed the only bridge that you guys have. Every attempt to pull the tank off the bridge failed, or out of the wreckage failed. So they then had to wait for the arrival of the division's bridging column before they can actually repair that bridge. And in the meantime, you have one battalion of tanks. You have maybe a battalion of dismounted Panzer Grenadiers who are able to scramble across the wreckage of the bridge, and you have this motorcycle company, and that's it. Everything else is going to have to wait a day at least for the bridge to be built.
And is it worth at this point just mentioning the terrain and what's changed since then? Because we've talked a lot about visiting battlefields, and there are great, people like James Holland and Peter Caddick-Adams and many others, John McManus, talk about the importance of visiting battlefields. Of course, we're going back that same enormity of the battlefield here, but also lots of changes between World War II and now. So here's a satellite image again, folks. So Volgograd, Stalingrad is kind of top center there, and the battlefield we're talking about is sort of bottom left there. Generally speaking, what's the terrain like around here, and how has it changed in those last 79 years?
The really striking changes on the left-hand edge of this picture, where you can see the Don River. It is so much wider now than it was at the time, and that's because of hydroelectric schemes that were built along it in the 1950s. So a lot of the villages along the Don that were scenes of bitter fighting at the time are now long gone. And of course, that results in backing up along the rivers that you can see running horizontally across this map. Just to the south of Verkhne Kumsky on this map, you can see Oktyabrski, and that is the river that we have just crossed, where unfortunately Hunersdorf's tank broke the bridge. Ahead of the column lies the Mishkova, which is that river running from right to left towards the Don above Verkhne Kumsky on the map. Once you've crossed that, it's pretty much a clear run all the way to Stalingrad, or Volgograd as it is on this map. The terrain is in your favor. Actually, the slope is in your favor too. So these two rivers become really quite important, even though they're quite small. The Panzer Division has its own engineers. it doesn't have any bridging capability. There is a bridging column that has been attached from corps level, but it's not really the same as, you know, the Bailey Bridge columns that would accompany Allied troops. It's a more improvised thing. Having said that, it's still really quite a resource. And in 1943 and 44, when the Red Army was advancing across Ukraine, they placed great value on capturing German bridging columns because they valued the equipment in them so much, because it was better than what they had, you know.
It's more of a case of these being engineers who would sort of improvise with materials sort of around, rather than having the, as we know, the dedicated Bailey Bridge that has all its different specifications for going over narrow rivers, larger rivers, and different weight classifications. So it's more of a traditional engineering situation.
Yeah, they will have some pontoons. They will have, you know, a whole heap of timber, decking, etc., but nothing as sort of like a Meccano kit, like a Bailey Bridge, where, you know, the guys can just turn up and build it as they've done on exercises countless times. It's much more a matter of looking at what you have there, improvising with what you have, using the equipment that you have to best effect. It's a very different sort of exercise.
Super.
So, the first crossing takes place on the 13th, and the bridge gets broken, and a fierce battle develops. The Germans advance very quickly and capture Verkhne Kumsky after a Stuka strike, and then become aware of quite a powerful column of Soviet armor advancing from the direction of Sogotskut to the east. And Hunersdorf demonstrates the great superiority of panzer divisions. Although in many cases the Germans are going to be outclassed by the T-34s that they face, what they do have is this wonderful combined arms and a flexible attitude and cooperation between different units. So he effectively lays a trap for this column. He blocks off the ones on the flanks, he smashes the one in the center, and reduces it to a tank graveyard. There are some graphic descriptions of this. I see a comment from Dave, how wide a span did they need to cover? You're probably looking at something about the size of the Thames at Henley. So we're talking about what? Maybe 100 feet, something like that, maybe rather more. Certainly it's not fordable. You can't chug across it in a vehicle. You're going to need proper bridging equipment in order to do this. But overall, on that day, the battle went pretty well. The Germans, you know, it's worth bearing in mind that at this stage, not all Soviet tanks had radios. They started Barbarossa with only the command tanks having radios, and the intention was that once the battle began, the commander of a tank company would communicate with his subordinates by waving flags out of the turret, which was not a great success, as you can imagine. And although they had become aware that, yeah, you needed radios, it takes time, just on the sheer scale of the Red Army, to provide that many radios in order to deal with this. But the Germans, on the other hand, have plenty of radios, and that's why Hunersdorf is able to mount this very, very flexible operation to smash this attack. And this is a great example of how you don't necessarily need the best equipment if you have really good coordination with what you have. And they did an outstanding job on that day. So overnight, the Panzer Pioneer Battalion of 6th Panzer Division has turned up. It's now labouring away at the bridge and trying to build it. Meanwhile, Red Army forces are threatening from the west. They are still along the Axe River, and they're trying to cut off this bridgehead. So even when the bridge is completed on the following morning, of the morning of the 14th, at this point, Hunersdorf still has to leave sizable resources to defend the crossings at Salievsky. He can't just press on, you know, without any regard for flank safety. If 17th Panzer had been there, everything would have been fine. But the delay in getting that division there is now really beginning to cost the Germans quite dear. He now managed to get a substantial battle force across, a battle group across the river. He pushed on to Verkhne Kumsky, and then became aware of this attack coming down from the northwest from Hill 95.6. he decided to deal with this. I'm sorry, my dog's just turned up. I'm just going to, because he knows I've got a drawer full of biscuits here. So anyway, he then decided to try a similar exercise to what had happened the previous day. Unfortunately, this time it didn't work out because the terrain was against him. The ground sloped up towards Hill 95.6, and the Soviets had learned their lesson. They'd also learned that these long-barreled Panzer IIIs were really pretty ineffective at anything over about 800 meters. So they sat back and they engaged them at longer range. So repeatedly, Hühnersdorf's tanks were feeling for the western flank of the Soviet position, trying to roll it up. But every time they turned north in order to try to do that, they just ran into more fire. They lost tanks, and only their long-barreled Panzer IVs were able to deal with the Soviet armor. By the end of the day, the Germans were forced to turn back to Verkhne Kumsky. They were pretty much out of ammunition by now, and not only that, they were also running low on fuel. Salievsky had been under artillery fire all day, limiting the amount of supplies that could come through. So with a very heavy heart, Hühnersdorf was forced to abandon Verkhne Kumsky and pull back to the river, thinking, okay, if we can regroup there, maybe tomorrow we can do this. Now, remember, all this time, Second Guards Army is en route. So another day has been lost, and really, we've got nowhere. They didn't advance anywhere. In fact, they've gone backwards. They've gone back 3 or 4 miles now, back to the Achse. So on the 15th, they're back on the river, and on the 16th, Little Saturn commences. This is the follow-on attack from the Stalingrad encirclement, and this is where the Red Army bursts through the lines of the Italians. And the poor old Italian 8th Army has been sitting on the Don here with very little by way of anti-tank armament. And you know, contrary to German accounts, the poor old Italians put up actually quite spirited resistance for quite a long time before they were overwhelmed. But it's worth remembering they had practically nothing that could deal with a T-34. They were in the retreat. I don't want to go down this particular rabbit hole, and perhaps we can do a Little Saturn and the Italians at a later date, and also just the general way the Germans treated their allies at a later date, because their treatment of the Italians was shocking. They blamed the Italians for collapsing, even though they hadn't given them the supplies and anti-tank guns they promised. During the retreat from the Don, German units regularly appropriated equipment from the Italians. They refused to share supplies with them. They turfed them out of villages onto the frozen steppe. And it was, you know, they treated them very, very badly. And maybe we can come back to that.
It is, and it's interesting, isn't it, Prit, that not only do the Germans talk about their own allies in negative terms, so much of our Western history, when we think of the Italians in the North African desert, is negative. And yet, actually, when you look at what they were doing in North Africa in 40 and 41 and what they were doing here, actually, spirited is a really good word you used earlier. Maybe they're outgunned, maybe they're out technologied, but they actually put up some seriously good fights and defense. It's important. We talked about the Christmas battle back in December with or in the Italian week, and yeah, the Italians are hard done by.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, when they were deploying out to the Eastern Front, at one point the Alpini was stopped in a railway siding, and stopped alongside them was a load of flat cars carrying German armor. And one of the Italian veterans later described how they sat there looking across at these Germans while aware that further down the train they had their own mules aboard the train, and just reflecting on the gulf that separated them from their allies. And yet here they were expected to hold back this torrent of Soviet forces. Now, I'm not a great, you know, in many respects, did the Germans have much air cover? Well, here is the problem. The Germans have considerable they don't necessarily have air superiority, but they do have the ability to intervene from the air. The problem that they have is, where exactly are they going to intervene? Because they have limited resources. Are they going to try to help out around the siege perimeter? Are they now going to have to divert off north to deal with these Soviet columns that are streaming down from the Don? Or are they going to support Kirchner's Panzer Corps trying to reach Stalingrad? At the same time, it's worth remembering, way south of this, you have 1st Panzer Army under Kleist, operating in the foothills of the Caucasus. And again, every time he gets air support, he can do something. When he doesn't get air support, he too grinds to a halt. So yeah, they do have air power, but it's very limited, particularly as by now, Richthofen has been forced to take several squadrons of Heinkel 111 bombers away from ground support operations to add them to the airlift going into Stalingrad. And that's, again, crippling their capacity to operate this.
Super.
Now we're going to get to a moment which, for me, goes slightly against the grain. Those of your listeners and viewers who have read my books will know that, slightly contrary to many historians, I'm not a huge fan of Manstein as the great operational genius. I feel that, like so many German commanders, his reputation is built largely on the memoirs that he wrote, which are very much self-serving. There are some very serious omissions and actual untruths in his memoirs, which kind of throws other bits of his memoirs into doubt. But here we are. I'm going to contradict that now by doffing my cap to him, because he does something now which, to my mind, is revolutionary. I haven't really seen this anywhere else. He does an almost Einsteinian equation of matching distance with time. He calculates that this enormous threat that is now developing along the Middle Don, striking down towards the northern Donetsk, is going to take time. It's going to take several days for those Soviet columns to get to a point where they are a serious threat to his positions. He knows that the only mobile forces that he can dispatch to deal with this are the very ones that he is relying on for his relief operation to Stalingrad. So he then equates distance and time and says, I have a number of days before I have to pull panzer divisions out of line and send them north. Moreover, he calculates that the longer he waits, the further south the Soviet forces will have come, and the less far his interception force will have to go to deal with them. And to my mind, this is actually a critical decision that is made, and I'm not sure that there were very many German commanders at the time, or indeed commanders anywhere, who would have been, prepared to do that juggler's trick of just throwing one ball up a little bit higher while you rearrange all the furniture so you can be sitting in the armchair when the ball comes down again. So on this occasion, yeah, well done, Manstein. This was,
and just to interrupt again, it's the point of this week. It's not about which tank can knock out which tank. It's about the deployment of forces. It's about predicting where the enemy are going to be, outmaneuvering, outthinking, and in this case, that thinking he was doing there sounds to be significant.
Very much so. And he's pretty much writing off the airfields. He knows there's every likelihood that the Red Army is going to overrun them. His calculation is, if Kirchner's Panzer Corps can break through to Stalingrad, those airfields become irrelevant anyway. And if they can't break through, then they're kind of irrelevant anyway. So, it's defending or stopping the Soviet thrust before it gets to the airfield is kind of pointless. So we may as well just use that time to do what we really need to do. Yeah. So we're now back on the back at Verkhne Kumsky and poor old 6th Panzer, trying to achieve this breakthrough. So on the 17th of December, by now, 23rd Panzer Division has moved up alongside, and with 6th Panzer's armor, they launch a new operation to try to reach Verkhne Kumsky. They reach Hill 146.9, but when they try to reach Verkhne Kumsky, they struggle, and they are constantly running into pack fronts. These are coordinated lines of anti-tank guns that play havoc with the German advance. And I've got a description here from Horst Scheibert, who was one of the tank commanders, a company commander at the time. And he writes, the position before us was excellently laid out, fairly small but with deep trenches, occupied by a very tough defender. None gave up, even though our entire tank battalion stood in the midst of their positions. The Russians had to be shot out one by one. We avoided driving to and fro in order to prevent tracks coming adrift. Remember, they're driving across frozen snow. Tanks coming adrift on the broken terrain. Each tank was assigned to a number of foxholes and waited until a Russian showed himself. It was a singular scene when I glanced around through the viewing scopes. The tanks stood like elephants with their trunks extended and appeared to be sniffing the earth. Finally, the riflemen, these are the Panzer Grenadiers, arrived in their half-tracks and under our protection cleared the entire position relatively quickly. But it gives you a great example of, well-positioned anti-tank weapons are great unless the other side has infantry support. Against unsupported armor, you're just never going to get through that position. So another day has been lost. The Germans are now back on the river, and they haven't been able to break through to Stalingrad. And all the time, Second Guards Army is getting closer. All the time, that avalanche of Soviet troops is pouring down towards the northern Donets. So on the 18th of December, a further attempt is made to break through and fails. And this time, the first Soviet prisoners of war from Second Guards Army are captured. So that mechanized brigade that has been fighting off 6th Panzer all this time has done its job to perfection. It's held them off long enough for the reinforcements to arrive. But there is still one last throw of the dice. Manstein has given the Panzer Corps another few days. This is it. This is now make or break. So on the 19th, now finally, all 3 Panzer divisions are in line, and they cross the river together, and they strike towards Verkhne Kumsky. There is a massive Stuka strike at the town, the village itself, which is by now reduced to ruins anyway. And critically, because the 17th Panzer has turned up and is able to support on the western flank, the armor of 6th Panzer, supported by 23rd Panzer, first of all rolls through Verkhne Kumsky, crushing what's left of 4th Mechanized Corps. I can't remember the name of the commander of 4th Mechanized Corps, but he very deservedly was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union for his prolonged defense of this village, because this is critical to the whole Battle of Stalingrad. Remember, this is, we're talking December here, these are very, very short days, not very much daylight. By the time they had taken Verkhne Kumsky and turned east, it was already growing dark. They rolled up the positions that had caused them so much trouble around Hill 146 as the evening light faded and the stars came out. And there then follows this epic night march to the Mishkova, and the risk of sort of just reading out loud, I'm going to read this because
it's going to be brilliant, don't worry.
This is one of the most, I love this. This is one of the most epic accounts that I've ever come across in memoirs. Again, this is Horst Scheibert, who is a company commander. So this is, as they're leaving Hill 146.9, it's now dark. The march towards the east seemed almost endless to me, somewhat unreal in the complete stillness around us. The moon rose slowly and allowed us to see the surroundings better. It was crystal clear and the snow seemed to glow from within. Our only concern was not to lose sight of the man in front. Sometimes we drove fast, then we stopped while the spearhead sought out the right route. As several tracks crossed our route and the roads marked on the map could barely be made out in daylight through the continuous snow sheet, the leading elements frequently chose the wrong turning. They often ran into ravines that were difficult to traverse. In order to lose no time, the companies still on the right road were assigned to lead the way while those in the rear followed. The shortest route was missed, so on this map they should have turned north before they actually did, but they missed the turning. We made a detour and then came across a good road running to our objective from the south. Here it was almost impossible to lose our way as a telegraph line ran alongside the road. Eventually I found myself in the middle of the battle group. More ravines, their icy overhangings shimmering with greenish moonlight. I have to admit that I had no idea where we were on the map, but trusted the spearhead and the commander completely. Either side of the road, I saw positions that seemed to be fully manned, so they're actually in the midst of Second Guards armies setting up now. My astonishment knew no limits, and it seemed ever more unreal, not least because of the complete stillness. Then we made a prolonged halt. My watch showed 2200, which meant midnight local time. We sat one tank behind another, closed up on the road. To the right, the telegraph line, further in front, a dark area, and beyond it, rising ground, apparently with a village on it. Right across the road near this rise, a well-constructed anti-tank ditch and positions could be made out. It was very cold, and suddenly armed Russian soldiers were standing amongst our tanks. More and more emerged from the darkness to right and left. We stared, peering out of our hatches at these guys, not sure if we could believe our eyes. My gunner made me aware that the Russians were still armed. I hissed, "Be still, they think we're Russians," in his ear and waited, expecting a shot at any moment. But nothing happened. On the contrary, they leaned on our tracks and tried to chat to us. There were no shots. Couldn't they tell that we were just babbling instead of speaking Russian? Couldn't they actually see the black crosses on the sides of our wagons? I fingered my pistol and put a hand grenade behind my seat. My God, what were we to do? This couldn't go on forever. I glanced at the vehicles in front and behind and saw the same scenes there. Anyway, after a while, the Russians disappear. Meanwhile, behind, a battle has broken out on 146.9. So this group is now cut off and is not sure it's going to get any supply. There were 30 to 40 tanks that had broken through. The Russians here had not been made aware that an armoured column was here. It couldn't go on. We could simply have gunned them down. These are the Russians around them. But leaving aside that we had been forbidden to open fire, we were reluctant to shoot at the curious Evans. In this manner, we passed an amicable 15 minutes. Suddenly, the peace was broken from up front. From the high ground that could be made out came a shot, followed by further shots and machine gun fire. We swiftly disappeared into our turrets, the Russians into the darkness, and then we advanced slowly but surely. So they now reach Vasilyevka on the Mishkova. This is the last major obstacle to Stalingrad. 48 kilometers. That's it. They've pretty much cracked it. Just before the bridge, we heard loud cries from further ahead. As I looked out of the turret, a reconnaissance vehicle came back past our column. In its turret was a face wearing a leather jacket and helmet. His face passed 3 meters from me, a Russian. By the time the moment of shock had passed, the vehicle had disappeared. It was shot as it passed the end of the column without success. Now the Russians were certainly aware we were here. We broke into the village. The few grenadiers with us dismounted, and by dawn had largely secured the village of Vasilyevka, and most importantly, were in control of the undamaged bridge. So this is now 2 a.m. on the 20th of December, and Hunersdorf sends a signal back from Vasilyevka to Raus at division headquarters. We have 2 weak half-track companies with us. I am in combat with enemy tanks and infantry in the attack objective. The bridge is secure. A rapid advance by Gruppe Zollenkopf, which is another battle group from the division, is urgently needed. We are out of fuel. So here they are. They have actually achieved their objective. It's taken them the better part of a week to move between these 2 rivers, but they have finally got there. They're out of fuel, running low on ammunition. They have very little infantry. They have the weight of Second Guards army gradually forming up around them. And all the time is running out. So this is really the end of the relief effort. The battle around Vasilyevka now continued for the next few days before the crisis developing further north required 6th Panzer Division to be pulled out of line and dispatched to deal with the consequence of Little Saturn, and that was the end of the relief effort. Could it have broken through had all 3 Panzer Divisions been available from the start? Well, you got to say it was possible, certainly before 2nd Guards Army turned up. Would it have made a difference? Well, there's the critical thing. Had they reached the siege perimeter, yes, there was a heavy supply column ready to roll. It would have revictualled part of 6th Army at least, but Hitler would never have given permission for the 6th Army to withdraw. It's highly likely the encirclement would have been renewed, only this time perhaps these Panzer Divisions would have ended up inside it, with dire consequences. And perhaps, the thrust, instead of just reaching those airfields on the northern Donetsk, would have continued all the way through to Rostov, and had even more catastrophic consequences. Well, it's really, you can speculate about what ifs or whatever, but here we have it, this extraordinary rolling battle for this village over a comparatively small amount of terrain, particularly given the scale of not only this battlefield, but the Eastern Front as a whole. And yet it was absolutely critical to the outcome of this relief effort, and the way that the battlefield unfolded.
No, a brilliant presentation. We're in the sidebar. There's echoes of Market Garden in this. That there's all sorts of references there, and it's interesting. You say that even if it had got through, it's almost a false dawn in the sense it's probably not going to change the bigger picture. It only changes that smaller picture. But what other lessons can we learn? Because obviously, your books are, as they're intending to be, they're explaining the history. So the what if scenario doesn't come into things, particularly in that kind of writing. But now we're on a YouTube channel, we can do this. Is there anything else at that point? You're back, you're Manstein or someone else, mid-December. What is there anything else they could have done there to change the situation in Stalingrad? Or is it already doomed? Is the writing on the wall?
Well, I think there are 2 key factors here, which I think hindsight often fails to take account of. It's always important when you're trying to guess what might have happened to try to think yourself into the shoes of the people who were there. Yeah. Remember that this is the, Battle of Moscow was not brilliant, but it didn't go, in the end, the Germans survived and they came out of it. So although Hitler got a lot of things wrong, generally he came out of it with his reputation to the soldiers, at least, and to the officers, intact. So at this point, the despair with Hitler's constant interference and micromanagement was not as established as it was even 6 months or a year later. The second thing that's worth remembering is poor old Friedrich Paulus sitting in Stalingrad. Paulus's last field command prior to being sent to take command of 6th Army was command of a battalion. He had no real experience of commanding regiments, divisions, corps, etc. Manstein was not going to give him an order to withdraw without Hitler's explicit permission. And, even in his memoirs, Manstein makes a point of constantly seeking that permission, and he didn't get it. Paulus, even if Manstein had been minded to give him a direct order to commence Thunderclap, which was meant to be the breakout, even if Manstein had issued him with an order, it seems to me inconceivable that Paulus would have obeyed it without confirmation from Hitler.
Right. And I'm thinking we see the question on screen there from Robin about, we know what Paulus did based on what actually happened, but you can't help wondering if that relief column had got, you said 48 miles, if it had got a bit closer, would that maybe have made him consider disobeying the order? And he didn't have to, because the relief column didn't get that close. But in that situation, might someone have nudged him? Or it's impossible to say. It's speculation, of course. But
it's very hard, because Seydlitz, who was one of his corps commanders, had instigated not exactly a mutiny, but at corps level, he had instigated them already planning an abandonment of the city and a withdrawal. And Paulus and his chief of staff, Schmidt, had stamped down on that with great vigor. So I've got to say, I can't see almost any circumstances, particularly in the context of late 1942, that Paulus, who was not renowned, we're not talking about a Guderian here. We're not talking about someone who's strong-minded and independently minded. He's a great staff officer, but he's not a brilliant field commander. And I can't see him ever doing that without explicit orders from Hitler.
Okay, makes sense. And then in the broader sense of what we're looking at this week, so armored actions, either from the Red Army point of view or the 6th Panzer point of view, are there any kind of key lessons you can see they learned during these 4 or 5 pretty amazing days that they took forward, or things they stopped doing that they realized weren't working? Any kind of conclusions you can draw?
Yeah, I think there are 2 points that are worth making here. At the end of the winter fighting, Hunersdorf wrote quite an extensive report, which was passed up the chain of command, where essentially he said, Panzer IIIs have had their day. They're really not very effective. And even with a long barrel 50mm gun outside a built-up area, they're not going to get close enough to a T-34 to deal with it. And that fed into the decision to divert Panzer III chassis production largely into assault guns, instead of continuing to produce tanks which were of limited value. They had experimented with trying to put a long 75 on a Panzer III, but it just wasn't big enough to do the job. So that was one thing. The other thing was, it highlighted, if you like, the beginning of a whole series of ploys by the Germans, none of which were ever ultimately successful, of how do we deal with this pesky pack front that was causing so much trouble. And the Red Army had learned this over the preceding year, 18 months, where if they could deploy a powerful line of anti-tank guns, it could cause enormous problems for the Germans. And the Germans really had no answer to this, and they never really came up with a decent answer to the pack front. The best they could do was, you got to find a way of outflanking it and then rolling it up from one side, which is fine if you can. But, a couple of questions that have come up about railways, just to kill those off. Yeah, the Soviets, and in fact the Russian railways, all operated on a different gauge. It was a wider gauge than the European gauge. This was deliberate policy in the 19th century out of fear of a Western invasion, and they didn't want Western armies, particularly German armies, using their railways. It's actually not too difficult to repin railway lines onto the different gauge. Some of the sleepers would have to be changed, but you could move one sleeper one way, the next one the other way. It can be done, and you could improvise a railway line. The problem was the destruction of railway lines as the Red Army withdrew. And throughout this period, it's worth remembering, there was only one intact railway bridge across the Dnieper River in Ukraine.
Right.
There were pontoon bridges carrying railways, but they were temperamental and not always available. There's only one proper railway bridge. So if you're dependent upon railways to move your equipment and you only have one crossing across the Dnieper, you've created an enormous choke point. And this was always a problem for the Germans. Not only that, they had expected to use captured coal from the Ukraine in the trains, but it turned out that the coal from the Donbass region was not of a suitable grade to be usable in German locomotives. So even to operate those locomotives that far east, you had to use train capacity to ship coal all the way from the Ruhr and Silesia, which places a further strain upon your railways.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. From Dave is asking what became of 6th Panzer after this.
Well, 6th Panzer was pulled out. It was used in the counterattack against Little Saturn, which I'll be very happy to come back and talk about, the recapture of the airfields. It took part in Manstein's counterstroke that stabilized the line at the end of the winter. And it took part in Kursk, on the southern flank of Kursk, and was involved in the fighting retreat across Ukraine. Hunersdorf became a commander when Raus moved on, and was killed by a sniper, I think either during Kursk or immediately after. At the time, his wife had moved to the Eastern Front and was working in a hospital either in Kharkov or Kiev. And yeah, he was a great loss to the division. He was very popular amongst the men, led from the front, as did so many of his contemporaries. And again, this is part of the forgotten side. Although the Red Army is losing a lot of personnel, the Germans are losing irreplaceable people, people like Hunersdorf, platoon commanders, senior NCOs, people who know how the system works. And these guys are never going to be replaced.
That makes sense. And I guess we'll wind things up fairly soon, but any kind of general things that were taken from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, because that's something we came up with the discussion with General Bolger yesterday about taking things from North Africa and Tunisia to the ETO. Obviously, the Red Army don't go to the West, but the Germans are, moving units around. Do they tend to sort of treat the Western Front and the Eastern Front entirely separately because of the geography, the terrain, the distances, or do they kind of exchange ideas back and forth?
It's a very good question, and I'm probably not qualified to answer it, and that my knowledge of the Western Front is fairly superficial compared to my knowledge of the East. Certainly, the Germans used the concept of the pack front with considerable effect around Normandy, and the British and American accounts will repeatedly talk about these fortified hedgerow lines, which were just a real pain and were very, very hard work to dig out. So yeah, the pack front was actually a German invention originally. The Red Army perfected it, and then the Germans took it back again. Yeah, message from William there. The antidote was infantry. Absolutely, it was. But the problem was that the Germans never had enough motorized vehicles, even within the Panzer divisions, to keep the infantry component as mobile as the tanks. Nor did they ever go for the Soviet solution of dedicated tank riders. Yeah, sure, Panzer Grenadiers rode on the tanks, but that was more of an improvised solution rather than dedicated teams, as the Red Army did. So you're right, a combination of artillery and infantry is the way to deal with these weapons. And yeah, they liked that.
Well, that's General Bolger yesterday said that the key to the success with the American Armored Divisions in ETO was combined arms, and one of the things we discussed yesterday was this idea is that sometimes historians who are knowledgeable about the air power talk about the air power, and those who know about artillery talk about artillery, and when you need to look at the armor and how it's used best, you have to take that overall view and look at how it works with logistics and this combined arms approach. So it's maybe a bit of a difficult question to answer in a single sentence, but of the Red Army and the German Army, kind of who is embracing the combined arms approach sooner, and who is better at it sooner?
I think there's no question the Germans were ahead of the game. We saw that with that first operation where Hunersdorf, and further north, all the way through this, it's worth, if you ever read Balk's memoirs or Mellentyn's memoirs, 11th Panzer Division was fighting an absolutely superb defensive action along the Cheer River line, dealing with 5th Tank Army. And yeah, if you want an essay in combined arms warfare, read Balk or Mellentyn on the Cheer line. I don't have much time for Balk generally. I think he's a self-glorifier par excellence, but my goodness, that was a well-fought battle, and he did an outstanding job. The thing is that the longer narrative of the Eastern Front is this sort of a graph of two lines really crossing. On the one hand, you have the Germans starting with this tradition of combined arms warfare, of flexibility, of delegated decision making, and it's becoming more and more rigid as they go through the war, with more and more top-down control, poorer quality NCOs and officers because of their losses, etc., etc. And on the other hand, you have the Red Army very, very deliberately learning. After almost every battle, there is a detailed analysis of what did we do wrong, what did we do right. Even when they get it right, how could we have done better? And they're learning all the time, and they're getting better and better and better at this. But even by the time you get to the battles in Crimea in 1944, one of the Soviet generals describes how he regards it as noteworthy in his memoirs that he personally intervened to call in further airstrikes at one point, because it wasn't normal for that sort of improvised link between ground and air forces to, to come up with a new solution just to deal with this particular problem in front of you. So the Red Army is getting better and better, and it really comes to a crunch in Bagration, which is one of my writing projects for a couple of years' time. But that's when the Red Army puts all of these lessons together. And one of the stories of 1943-44 is the Red Army is they're identifying what went wrong quite well, but a lot of the solutions they come up with are actually not right. But finally, when it gets to Bagration, they get it right. And my goodness, it's effective.
And that makes sense, because I'm increasing my knowledge of the Eastern Front all the time, thanks to your information, your books and your presentations. But it seems to me, in the simplistic view of it, sometimes they talk about there's like a single point, and I wouldn't claim which date it is, where the Germans, having going from doing well, start doing badly, and the vice versa. The Red Armies start going from doing bad to doing well. And to me, it's much more nuanced than that, because even after the Red Army are on the front foot, they still are making mistakes. And as we can find out today, the Germans can still pull things out of the bag after they're losing they're losing the war by now, but they are still managing to achieve victories in battles. And looking at it as a sort of changeover on a single date is too binary.
So by this stage, it's fair enough to say that, at an operational and strategic level, the Red Army has the ascendancy.
Yeah.
At a tactical level, and to an extent at an operational level, the Germans can hold their own. At a tactical level, they still have the edge, definitely. So the curves are crossing, but that's where they've got slightly stuck here.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, I think the main thing is we'll just invite you back and talk about Little Saturn or something else at a future date. And it's exciting, because I'm going to be matching up all the 80th anniversaries that are coming up. So I'm already thinking of what's happening in this year for 42 and what's next year for 43. And so that's what we're working on right now. So you're always welcome anytime to come back. But we've learned a lot, and it's better to leave the crowd wanting more. So I think we'll invite you back another time. I'll just remind people what we got coming up, and I'll come back and say hello to you in a second. So folks, tomorrow evening, Jonathan Ware is back on again. Remember, he was on talking about the British Tommies in the Ardennes. He's going to kind of bust some myths about the Western Front in Normandy, German armor, British armor. These myths about you can't knock out German tanks with Shermans, that kind of thing. So look at the British steel in Normandy. So that'll be a great show there. I expect lots of rabbit holes. So have a glass of whiskey ready tomorrow for going down various rabbit holes with Don. And then Friday, we've got two shows, one in the morning GMT time, because we're doing a show with Daniel in Australia, and then one in the evening, Nicholas Moran, the chieftain on YouTube, is coming to talk about tank destroyer operations in North Africa and Tunisia. So as usual, if you've just found the channel, don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to check out the channels of my friends like JD at History Underground, Brad on This Day in Canadian Military History. There are other great content providers out there who also need your support. So spread the love, folks. Think about sharing what we're doing on social media. And of course, get yourself onto the bookshop of your choice and get some of Prit's books if you haven't already, because you will find them as rewarding as I do. So there we are. Thank you very much, Prit, for joining us. And we will next time we talk, we will have another conversation about curries, I hope. So that'll be great.
Look forward to it.
Cheers to everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV, saying I'll see you all again tomorrow evening. Thanks for your time today. Bye, everybody.